Hi, everybody. I'm Soledad O'Brien, and I am the moderator for a very important conversation that is at its core about justice. Louisiana not only chronically underfunds public defense, but it is the only state with a public defense system that's forced to survive predominantly, almost two-thirds, off of user pay. We'll walk through what that is exactly a little bit more, but basically traffic tickets, fines, and court fees paid by the very people that public defenders represent, those who are too poor to afford an attorney. Louisiana may now lose public defense altogether. So today we're going to talk to public defenders, a judge, somebody who spent 27 years in the prison system after being wrongfully convicted, to learn about what's at stake in Louisiana and also how can we save the right to counsel, which is guaranteed under the Sixth Amendment. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to members of our panel. The Honorable Judge Calvin Johnson is retired, I should say. He was the first elected African-American judge in the Orleans Parish Criminal District Court. He was also the first African-American chief judge of criminal court, the first Louisiana judge to have a mental health court, and one of the first judges to implement drug court. Judge Johnson remains on the faculty of the Loyola Law School and is currently working with federal monitors who were appointed by Judge Lance Africa at the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana around the issue of proper care for defendants with mental health issues in the parish prison. So welcome to you, Judge.
Oh, thank you very much for just allowing me to be on this show with you and to be able to talk about justice in Louisiana and also justice in America.
Well,
it's a great joy being here.
It's a big topic, and the joy is all mine. Up next is Meg Garvey. She's a career public defender and legislative advocate for criminal justice issues. Her first official appearance on the record was on behalf of more than 100 people who were trapped in jail without access to courts after Hurricane Katrina. Meg was a founding member of the Orleans Public Defenders, where she's worked for years representing poor people, supervising attorneys, and developing initiatives within the office and the system. She also serves as the legislative chair of the Louisiana Association for Criminal Defense Lawyers. It's so nice to have you, Meg.
Thanks so much for having us, and thanks so much for shedding light on this really important topic.
Up next is Derwin Bunton. He leads the Orleans Public Defender's Office. Under his leadership, OPD has risen to be one of the most respected public defenders' offices in the country, winning numerous awards and accolades, including recognition by the Innocence Project of New Orleans, the Frederick Douglass Human Rights Award from the Southern Center for Human Rights, and the prestigious NLADA Clara Shortridge Foltz Award, which is given every 2 years to the most outstanding public defender office in the entire nation. Derwin, it's so nice to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting this very important conversation.
You bet, it's my pleasure. Elena Booth is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, currently serving as first felony assistant and director of students for the Baton Rouge Office of Public Defender. As a director of students, she has increased diversity in new attorney hires and raised awareness of the importance of public defense at local law schools. Ms. Booth also serves as the social justice chair for the Baton Rouge branch of the NAACP. Elena, it's so nice to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and we're extremely excited that you are bringing national coverage to this really important issue. Thank you.
My pleasure. Last but not least, Norris Henderson is a surrogate for Represent Justice and also the founder and executive director of both Vote and its sister organization, Voters Organized to Educate. He believes that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Norris was wrongfully incarcerated for 27 years and has firsthand experience of the racism and brutality in the criminal justice system. Norris, it's so nice to have you.
Thank you, Soledad, and I'm just as excited as everybody here to talk about something that's long overdue, a discussion we should have had 1,000 years ago.
Well, then we better get to it, right? Because we're delayed, and it's a conversation that I hope leads to real change. Because I do think we have these conversations about justice a lot, but I want to walk away with real tangible opportunities to move the needle. So I'm going to begin with Judge Johnson, if I may. I would love for you, sir, to start with a little bit of your backstory. You said you've been with the criminal justice system for 57 years, since 1963. Tell us a little bit of your backstory and why public defense is so essential to everyone.
I saw first African American prosecuted for aggravated rape in a little courthouse that looked like one of those famous things you saw on television in a famous story. I saw him prosecuted. This is 1962 for a crime he didn't commit. Everyone in the room knew he didn't rape the white woman. And everyone knew that he wasn't properly represented, that he didn't really have a lawyer at all. I said, then watched it. A year later, I was in the civil rights demonstration in Plaquemine, Louisiana, and I eventually was arrested. I was in the church where James Farmer, who was the director of the Congress of Racial Equality, wrote a book about, because he escaped in a casket to keep from dying there. I got prosecuted for it. I got convicted for it. I was placed on probation, and the only thing I could do was go to college to Southern Baton Rouge, which I did. I was finished college, ended up in the military, ended up finally in law school, which is where I wanted to be. From the time I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. I met Thurgood Marshall when I was 10. I wanted to be a lawyer, and I went to Loyola, and I became that lawyer. I became a public defender. I tried my best, Derwin, to do that to the very utmost of my ability and skill. I wasn't that good at it. So then I tried doing civil law to the utmost of my ability. I wasn't very good at that either. So then I did what most of us who can't practice. I went to law school and became a teacher. And so I did that for 8 years. And then I got elected to the criminal court in 1990 and became a criminal court judge. And did drug courts and mental health courts, because those were issues and still are issues in the justice system in terms of who comes into the system, in terms of how they are treated when they come into the system. And I use the word retired because that's the polite way to say it. I didn't retire, really. I just quit. And that's a fact. I just simply quit. And I quit because I got sick and tired of doing what the justice system required me to do, which was to put people in jail in so many instances for little or nothing, and to watch them be represented by people who didn't have the resources, didn't have those things that was necessary to do proper defense, simply didn't have it. And I saw all of that. And so I quit. And as a result, of course, of all of what I say, I have been able to see all of the changes that have been made in the system, all that has come in the system. I've been able to see the Derwins come. I've been able to see funding come that was not necessarily enough, but much, much, much more than what existed if you go back in time, much, much more. In New Orleans, I was able to see it. Yet I was also able to see how legislative acts over the course of time contributed to mass incarceration in our city, mass incarceration in our state. I saw it. I saw it play out. I saw it play out with white judges who had no ability whatsoever to understand the reality of people of color and could care less about people of color. I saw all of that. And so it's a joy to sit here today and see all of these people who are joining us, Soledad, on your show, who have done and are doing magnificent things. They truly, truly are. But there's so much work left for us to do. And so it's just a joy for me to be here and to now listen to them tell us some about all that magnificent stuff that they do.
Quick follow-up for you, sir. So explain to people, though, why it's not just important to have a public defender. I think anybody who's watched any kind of, legal process type show would understand that. But the fully funded part of it, I think for a lot of us who are not attorneys, it was nothing we've ever really thought about. Why is that so critical and so important to someone's constitutional rights?
The system operates such that the prosecutor, a person gets arrested, The prosecutor is assigned to the case at that point in the process. On the defense side of it, the person gets arrested, and in some places he's lucky if he ever gets assigned to a competent defense attorney. That's a luck. He gets assigned to someone, though, and this is history of it, who didn't have the resources, didn't have the investigator, didn't have the law clerk, didn't have the time to give to a person's case. You have to have time to think about your case, to think about how you represent a person. That takes resources. So you have the wherewithal, but also the space. And you're not so overburdened with clients that you can't properly represent the least of them, because you invariably end up representing those who are the most serious charged. And so you let those go, the least of them. And that's just horrific things that happen to people who come in justice. So money, resources is what the justice system needs on both sides of the aisle. The prosecutor needs it to do justice. Then that's a conversation we can have. The defense needs it to do justice, and likewise, that's a conversation we can have.
So Derwin, as the head of the Public Defense Office in New Orleans, are you running an office that does not have adequate funding?
I am running an office that does not have adequate funding. We haven't had adequate funding from the inception of our system, and it was designed that way. We have a user pay criminal legal system in Louisiana, and by that I mean we depend inordinately on fines, fees, and costs levied against the people going through the system in order to pay for the system. On average, about 2/3 of public defender budgets around the state depend on these conviction and user fees to do their job. And it's inadequate, it's unreliable, and it's inequitable. And we've seen that play out around the state. We've seen it play out in our office. In our office, we go year to year. I essentially have to shake a magic 8-ball and ask it about my budget year to year. And the answers vary from year to year, from better not tell you now to outlook not so good when I shake my magic 8-ball, because it is impossible to plan when a system which is aimed at the poorest and most vulnerable depend on the poorest and most vulnerable to fund it.
What decisions have you had, I assume there are decisions that you've had to make because you don't have the money? Give me an example.
Well, probably the worst sort of budget crunch we hit was about 8 years ago, when I had to lay off about 1/3 of the office immediately, because we were looking at budget shortfalls and had been depending on support from decision makers that didn't come. And I had to go around in a single day and cut my office by 1/3 and tell them all they had no jobs. And tell them all they had no jobs immediately. That was probably the starkest thing I've had to do as chief. I also have had to cut expert fee funding so that if you need someone to test your DNA, or a psychological or psychiatric expert, you may not get it in your case if you're a frontline lawyer in my office, or we may have to litigate to try and find that funding that is so critical to that case. I've had to furlough folks multiple times, including this year during the pandemic, because we simply don't have the funding. And folks watching need to understand, in Louisiana, when you're a user pay system, your highest volume court is your biggest funder. And for us, that's traffic court. And so the joke that your right to a lawyer depends on how many traffic tickets are issued is actually not a joke in Louisiana. It runs exactly directly in proportion to how many traffic citations are issued and how many are paid, because those are your highest volume pieces of revenue in our system.
So Meg, both the judge and Derwin have talked a little bit about user pay, but I want you to step back a little bit for me. obviously it's sort of fees that are collected off of the poorest of the poor. Does every system work like that, or is it just Louisiana, or is it just New Orleans? And where does it come from? Like, what's the history of how people decided that that was a viable way to fund public defenders?
So yeah, so starting with your first question, no. We're the only state that relies primarily on that particular source of funds to fund public defense. The public defense isn't funded properly in many jurisdictions, right? And probably in most states. But yes, Louisiana is decidedly an outlier in using that methodology. And as Derwin pointed out, there's so many problems with that. I mean, he, gestured towards the ethical issue, right? We're fighting against fines and fees, and we're fighting against convictions because that's what a zealous lawyer does, right? But when we do that, we're actually theoretically fighting against our own funding, and that is, really an untenable conflict of interest that nobody with money would tolerate, right? Nobody that had a choice would ever hire a lawyer that they thought had some interest in working against their own interest. I mean, that's sort of one of the most basic ethical rules in anything, whether it's defense or not. And then also, some of the other situations that Derwin pointed out about the vulnerability of that funding source, right? So you have an emergency. We have a lot of emergencies in Louisiana, right? So, Katrina, right? People aren't in town, right? So there's not tickets being written, and that revenue source is drying up. Then you have, for example, in Baton Rouge, where Elena works, there was a terrible flooding situation, and the revenue source dried up then. It's also vulnerable to politics, right? Because sheriffs are elected, right? And so it's vulnerable to sort of decision-making policies by elected people. So let's say for some reason they decide to stop writing tickets, maybe because they're running for office and they want everybody to be on their side, or because they just sort of decide to shift priorities or something. Who gets caught in the middle? It's us, right? And the other thing is that when you're talking about this from a statewide point of view, it's not like tip sharing, right? All the money doesn't go into one pot and then get dispersed out. It stays in that particular parish, which means if you're from a really rural parish, which, we have a tremendous amount of poverty in New Orleans, and we have a lot of, issues in New Orleans, but there are places in Louisiana that decidedly have a higher poverty rate even than, some of the urban centers. And if those places are far from a major thoroughfare like the interstate, they don't have that source of revenue. So it's not geographically consistent. So there's a lot of problems with the way that it works. Now, as to the history of it, it's been that way since I've been here. I mean, honestly, I think
laws you're pointing out, right? It doesn't take a genius to recognize that that those are going to be problems when you're collecting money not only off the backs of the poorest citizens, but also in an environment where you can issue tickets and people haven't left because of a hurricane or that people aren't driving around. So yeah. I'm just curious if people had been flagging this as a problem from its very inception.
Well, we have. But I think, if you're talking about the motivation for it, if you're talking about the history for it, I think it just comes from the fact that this is considered an afterthought, right? I think that public defense has been legislatively an afterthought, which is really tragic considering that, it's a constitutionally mandated service by the state, right? And quite honestly, I don't think, once again, talking about not taking a genius, it doesn't really take a genius to figure out why, right? Who are the majority of people that are coming through the system, right? When we're talking about indigent defense, right, we're talking about people who don't have money. And when you don't have money in this country, it's hard to have power. And when you don't have power, it's hard to get anybody in government to listen to you, which is why I think public defenders, and not just the people on this call, but just more generally, I think more public defenders are realizing that part of being a public defender, even though you don't have time to do all of your cases and all of that, you have to get involved in policy and you have to get involved in this level of advocacy, because otherwise you're bearing witness to a lot of things that are never going to change, because you're the sort of main voice and you're the connection with those people. So I think, honestly, I think the origins of it are racism.
That cues up Elena very well, because I'm curious if she feels that being in the system, did it make you realize that you had to start getting involved in policy because you were watching sort of things unfold that just were not okay? Number one, I guess, would be my question for you, Elena. And also, I'm curious, like, give me a sense of how many cases you deal with. What's your day like? What's it like to be a practicing public defender in East Baton Rouge?
So yeah, I think Meg is right on. I think that I felt like I had to get involved, which is the reason why I got involved with NAACP and LACDL and all these different organizations that did policy work, because I think what you see in the courtroom is just trauma. It's Black trauma all day, every single day. And I think for me not to get involved, there's no way that I could stay in this work, because conversations like this give me hope that maybe that there will be a change, that we can bring national coverage to this dying situation here in Louisiana. But to answer your question about what's the day-to-day like before the pandemic, I would have court 5 days a week. Right now, or really at any given time, I could represent between 200 to 250 people. Most of those cases being felony cases. However, before the pandemic, I think I was compartmentalizing and only representing really 10 to 15 people a day, right? I think that's the only way you could get through or even be able to manage to even think about the fact that you represent that many people. And you get little wins in the courtroom here and there, like a motion you win, or you'd get a bond reduction, or you would be able to get to tell someone's story. But after since the pandemic has happened, court shut down, which meant that before the pandemic, our clients couldn't reach us by phone. So they weren't able to have free phone calls from the jail. So really, you only had to focus on those 10 or 15 people you represented in court every single day. But when that communication barrier got lowered and it was eliminated because of the pandemic, and we weren't able to get into jail, so they gave our clients free phone calls. Oh my God. I mean, I would literally like step away just to have lunch for 30 minutes and I would come back to 14 missed calls. I felt the complete and entire weight of my caseload when that pandemic happened. And to know how many people were trapped in jail that you represent was insane. I don't understand, I know in DC and other places that there's caseload caps between 20 to 30. I don't believe that the people in different places such as Washington deserve better than what, people in Louisiana do. What's the difference? You would never give a doctor 200 patients and say, hey, diagnose them, go through their history and their social history and find out their symptoms and find out why they're in this situation. But you expect for me to do that for over 200 people. This is completely not healthy. It's not healthy for any public defender, and it's not healthy for any of my clients. I just had to tell a client the other day that his brother died from COVID-19, and you feel bad not to answer the phone because you're the only connection that they have. It's because you are the only person they can call for free. But you also have to remain healthy, because if I'm unhealthy, then I'm unhealthy for them. So, right now it's impossible. I don't believe that I'm managing very well. And I think a lot of public defenders in Louisiana aren't managing very well.
Norris, we mentioned in your introduction that you've experienced injustice within the system, and obviously you've worked with public defenders. Give me a sense of how that lack of funding affects people on the inside. So that point of view, how does it perpetuate systemic racism and basically just injustice from someone who's incarcerated's point of view?
Well, for years, the system, once you got convicted of a crime and went to prison, you still relied on this very same public defense system to file your appeal. And just like Alana was saying, is that looking at the caseload that they have, they're looking at the people right in front of them. They're not looking at that cold case that, as soon as that person is convicted, it's the next man up. And so inside, I had fortune and misfortune. I was a jailhouse lawyer, worked in the prison library, and got to see what that caseload looked like. To fight for folks who, one, couldn't get access to the very same records that they needed to kind of like continue to fight their cases. The court don't make an exception for you because you're in prison. There are timelines that you got 30 days once your case becomes filed to file, your cert in the court. And if you don't file it, you just lose your case at that moment. And so the burden was for years that, and I think Meg stated that folks frankly didn't care. And so it was because of folks outside and folks inside steady complaining about, hey, the emperor has no clothes on, that sooner or later somebody stopped to look. But no, the burden became even more greater because even the fact that something happened that became a constitutional issue that would be a watershed moment, that everybody in prison could benefit from this opportunity. The next thing was, well, who's going to represent them? There's nobody to represent these guys. And so in Louisiana, you don't have a right to counsel on post-conviction. So once you get to prison, it's about hook or crook. And when I showed up in the prison, the academic average for folks was like fifth grade. So if you had any kind of aptitude, your education became a premium. And so imagine being in an environment, 5,000 people, and more than 85% of them is like on a fifth grade level. So who's going to help who? And so you relied on this system that you just left, the public defender system that was already overburdened, and you're reaching back out to that very same lawyer saying, hey man, I still need your help. And as much as they want to help you, they really couldn't. And I didn't really understand that until I became that jailhouse lawyer with having over 500 and 600 cases myself and every day trying to figure out how do I connect the dots with this guy, trying to find him some external help because we can only take him so far. Mm-hmm. And so our system has always been propped up in a way that it was set up to do exactly what it do, to ensnare you. And once it got you into that net, it wasn't like these TED, these turtle extracting devices where you get to a certain spot and it kick you out. You got caught up in this net, you're in that net. And so when the judge say how he watched this mass incarceration boom just take a hold, it was primarily because the system never was on equal footing, and that contributed to a lot of things. I mean, even today with the United States Supreme Court finding one of the practices here in this state to be unconstitutional. Well, the first thing the prosecutors ran to do is say, oh, we need to stopgap this. We don't need this to apply to all the people we have abused over the last 100 years. And so this system has never been set up where they're looking for parity or they're looking for equality in the system. So I am really excited and glad to be, from the day I set foot out of prison in 2003, this has been my journey. This has been my destination to make sure that what happened to me and thousands of other people would never happen to anybody else. And I think as we go forward in this conversation, thinking back just 15 years ago, our public defender system was more judge-centered than it was client-centered. And when we tried to shift to being more client-centered, we got more resistance from the system because they wanted to maintain the status quo. You don't need to represent nobody from start to finish. You represent him, you show up in my courtroom. When I tell you to show up in my courtroom, I'll sign you to represent John Doe, and that's who you represent. You don't stay with John Doe from start to finish. So, no, this is a real systemic problem, And I am glad to kind of be a part of this core group of people who have been fighting to bring change in this state.
So Meg, you talked a lot about what's happening in Louisiana, but nationally, are public defenders just woefully underfunded? Maybe not as badly as they are in Louisiana, but is there sort of similar issues around funding and financing everywhere in the country, or for much of the country?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some jurisdictions where the state does provide all of the funding for the public defender system for that state, right? And that seems to be in line with what the Constitution says. But that doesn't mean that they're actually getting all of the resources that they need to do what they need to do. And I think that, it all sort of ties in together, right? Because, you heard what Nora said about, there constantly being legislation to try to increase the penalties or try to decrease people's ability to re-enter society after they've spent time in prison and learned trades and done all these things where they could really be making a great contribution to the community. And there's all these layers, right, to get out of jail. And a lot of times, and it sort of depends on the jurisdiction, but a lot of the time, the people that are bringing those bills that are asking for that kind of legislation are people who work as prosecutors, people who work for the prosecutor's lobby. Sometimes there are people who are sheriffs, or people that work in law enforcement, or people that work more connected to a prison system, right? So you can see how there's sort of this money aspect in a lot of the people that are pushing these laws. But what I think is really important to think about in terms of public defense and in terms of, a lot of the conversations that people have been having since COVID, since, everybody's having to deal with the concept of austerity in the context of their own, personal budget, but just also in general, when we're thinking about government and we're thinking about priorities, and people are talking about, maybe this part of the system isn't really where we want to be putting all of our money because it doesn't make us safer and it's not a way to take care of our citizenry. So I think what's important to consider is that a prosecutor, so an elected district attorney, has a lot of ability to make choices. They have a lot of discretion in what they prosecute, which means that they have a lot more control over how to spend their money, how to make a budget, and how to prioritize what public money is going to do, right? How are they representing their constituents? What cases are they going after? Are they focusing on nonviolent crimes? Are they still prosecuting marijuana? I'm sure, for a national audience, probably that's old news. But in Louisiana, people still get arrested and go to jail for marijuana, right? That's not something that they necessarily have to do. Are they still using a broken windows approach? Are we still stopping everybody on the street who's in the way or seems homeless or, kind of just because they're poor? Are we still doing those things? And I think that's a really important thing to consider, because when you're looking at it from the angle of a public defender, we don't get to have that kind of discretion, right? When we cut corners to be able to get our work done within the confines of the limited resources that we have, the Constitution is being violated, right? It's not ethical for us to do that, but it is smart and perfectly ethical and perfectly legal for a district attorney to make an evaluation of every case that comes through and decide, how am I furthering the goals of my community by prosecuting this? Is this something that is worthy of taxpayer resources? And so I think that is a conversation that can be had all across the country. And I think it's a conversation that people are seemingly being willing to talk about in Louisiana. I think we're moving in that direction here too.
And maybe across the country. I guess, Derwin, this question can be for you, because we've been talking a lot about exposure to COVID-19 in the jails, not just for people who are incarcerated, but for people who are working there as well. And then lots of protests, obviously, and conversations about police violence. So, Derwin, I'm curious, where does the conversation about the constitutional crisis in Louisiana fit in? Is that a piece of this conversation as well?
It is, and I think part of what public defenders do relates heavily to that conversation. When the pandemic hit our community, one of the things we did was mobilize to get as many people out of that jail as possible, out of our Orleans Parish Prison, because we know from the science and what everything we were being told and reading and learning is that once it gets in, it's going to act the same way it acts in nursing homes. It's in a big box. It's going to spread fast. And we know from knowing our clients that disproportionately, our clients are at risk when it comes to COVID-19. We have a lot of clients with high blood pressure, with pre-existing conditions, diabetes, and we were terrified for what was going to happen to our clients and for the staff there, the sheriff deputies, the medical professionals. And so we worked to get that jail down to its lowest number now that it's been in 30 years in Orleans Parish Prison, because we started filing motions, we started arguing, we partnered with community and community bail funds, and we got folks out of jail. And that's what folks need to understand. The system, when it's acting the right way, and we get blips on the screen here, public defenders protect innocents, fight for our clients, and hold power accountable. And when we're funded to do that, it makes our system work better. It makes people who would be in harm's way in our jail people who are now out of harm's way in our jail. And the constitutional conversation that we need to have also should point back to the history of our cause. Over 250 years ago, there was a mass shooting that required representation in a fledgling territory. It was the Boston Massacre in what would become the United States of America. Those soldiers could not find a lawyer. They were poor, they were young, abandoned by the king, and the person that represented them for no money. And that was John Adams, our second president of the United States. Our history is a noble one, and one that predates the Republic. It predates the founding of our United States. And folks need to understand that's how important this right is. We are one of the 10 original amendments to the Constitution. The founding fathers didn't get rid of slavery, but they gave us all lawyers. That's the joke I tell to folks, but it's also quite true. So when we talk about the conversation that needs to be had around public defense, the constitutional conversation that needs to be had, we should be thinking about that history and how that history got abandoned to create a system that is baked in these inequities and these disparities here in Louisiana and elsewhere. And what you'll find is a lot of similarities throughout the Deep South when it comes to how poorly public defense is funded, how poorly it is structured, how poorly it is monitored. And I don't think it's an accident that it's the Old South that has a lot of these systems at play, because these systems aimed at poor Black and brown people are designed to not be equal, to not be equitable, and to not really provide justice. And we see those outcomes over and over again, not the least of which in Louisiana is our high exoneration rate. We have probably the highest as a city of wrongful convictions of anywhere in the country. And that is a direct consequence of having a system that is out of balance, inequitable, with a funding and structure that makes sure it is inequitable and unfair.
Norris, can you give me a specific example, a specific story of somebody who's not having a public defender led to an unfair trial, or that they were convicted and got an unjust amount of time?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can literally just kind of like roll call with, and Durham mentioned the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project actually got its start from us being inside. In 2001, a student from Tulane came to Angola and was like, hey, look, I got an idea. And we at this time was like, we were pressed because we had guys that we wanted to help, and just didn't have the resource to do it. And I think I'll go back to our first exoneree, was Clyde Charles. He was a guy who every day he came to the library. He was kind of like illiterate, but this guy always said he didn't do it. And every time I would hear it, I don't care how you would tell that story, at the end of it would always boil down for me saying, this guy just didn't have the resources available to him. Fast forward, Barry Scheck and them come on the scene. This guy writes a plea to Barry Scheck. Barry Scheck and them respond, gets the DNA tested. Lo and behold, bang, first innocent guy that we know straight up going out of the prison. What you think the state did in response to that? In response to that, when and kind of let me back up. Prior to 1986 in Louisiana, you did not have the right to inspect a police report or a district attorney file. So whatever you showed up in court, whatever they say you done, that's what you were standing up against. So in 1986, in this case, Lemon versus Connick, the court ruled that, no, these things are public record. We start getting these public records and we start finding all these guys who in their police reports were being identified as being 6 foot tall when they're 4'11", being black when they actually was white. And our legislators' response to that was they changed the public record laws where prisoners were declared non-persons when it came to accessing public records. And so what happened, that burden shifted right back to the public defender. That's like, hey man, I got a case, but I need some help because I can't do nothing for myself. So, you know, we got Clyde Charles, we got Glenn Davis, we got Terrence Hitt, we got Archie of Recent, Archie Whitman, Richard Prohom, Malcolm Alexander. So it goes on and on and on. Like Durbin said, we lead the nation in exonerations, and it's primarily because those public defenders at the onset didn't have the resources to hire the investigator who could have went into the community and found out what this. Cornell Napa, I remember this case perfectly clear. He said, I shot this guy in self-defense. Somebody moved the gun. Until his family was able to hire a lawyer who was a non-public defender, they actually tracked down the witness who actually saw somebody pick up the weapon and discard it. But the guy stayed in prison 12 years before he got done. And so not having those resources on the front end, grave results on the back end, because there's no guarantee that you'll ever get out of prison once you get in. For all of us who have been fortunate enough and blessed enough to resurface, it's by the grace of God that we are here, because this system wasn't set up for us to go in and kind of like bang on the day and say, I'm sober, Dolman, let me out. It wasn't set up that way. And so it's just as equally hard for folks inside who needs the help and support of the public defenders. And, you know, they're overburdened as is. When the Supreme Court struck down Graham and Montgomery, folks start looking for lawyers because they realize these folks have to be resentenced. Well, who's going to represent them? And so, you know, no, we have a whole plethora of people who have been, you know, we can call roll. We can literally call roll across the state of Louisiana, and every parish has, Orleans is the biggest outlier in the sense of having exonerees, but all across this state, this system has been unjust to poor people in this state.
So then, Judge Johnson, I'd like you to pull out for me to sort of the 35,000-foot view. Clearly, this is a very important social and racial justice issue. Does that put it on the front burner, do you think, or does that relegate it to the back burner? I mean, a lot of the conversations we're having today that are being centered in media coverage, frankly, are about racial and social justice, at least for the moment.
Race matters. And to recognize it in terms of social settings, to recognize it in terms of equity, to recognize it in terms of all aspects of life in America is one thing. But to recognize it and how it plays out in the justice system is quite another. the insidiousness of the justice system. And that's what we're listening to from all who now have had an opportunity to speak, is the insidiousness of it. The not allow Elena's clients to talk to her without being able to pay for the phone call. The insidiousness of it, to have the people who get a traffic ticket to pay for a lawyer to represent them in another system. The insidiousness of it, to use black bodies that came into the justice system as commodities, to pay for aspects of the system, to pay for sheriffs in their jails, to pay for private prisons and their operations, to pay for bail bondsmen, to pay these costs, to use black bodies to do it. This is the same thing we did. Pick the 100 or so years ago you want to go back and come forward. What we were doing in 1866, 1867, 1870, we're doing in 2020. The same thing. We've just dressed it in different clothes. And we talk about it in different ways. But we're still using black bodies who come into the justice system to pay for aspects of it with their bodies. That's what we do. That's what the justice system does. And so it operates in a way to be sure that those bodies stay, like Norris is suggesting, in the prison system and can't get out, because prisons get paid for that, to stay in jails and can't get out, because jails and sheriffs get paid for that. And if they get out, bail bondsmen who help to fund other aspects, that is those who run for office, get paid for that. And so this is the insidiousness of it. And for us not to recognize it is on, for lack of a better word, sinful. But it is also all about race. Soledad, it's all about race.
Elena, is there a debate? I mean, are there people who, is it like a fight between the people who support user pay and people who are against user pay, and then they're fighting it out in the state of Louisiana? Or are there lots of people kind of in a bipartisan way who could be talked into changing this?
Yeah, so that's the reason why I'm glad we're having this conversation. I am hoping that people wake up and understand that this system is funding public defense off the back of our clients. I don't want our office to get paid every single time someone gets convicted. That creates mistrust with my client. That creates mistrust in this community. We don't want to be funded like this. It brings it back to, for us, for 2016. In 2016, when there was, we already were in a crisis. We already had to lay off a lot of people. And then on top of that, we had the unfortunate and tragic killing of Elton Sterling. When that happened, people took to the streets. People were tired. People protested. But when that happened, this city shut down. And when this city shut down, that meant that court shut down. And when court shut down, it meant that people can't get convicted. And I mean, God forbid that a black man can't get convicted. That is what happened. And now the public defender's office didn't get paid. So when that happened, then after that in Baton Rouge, we had the 3 killings of police officers. Then we had the flood in Baton Rouge. So it was one thing after another. And in all of that time, we already was in a crisis. And then we became even more, dive deeper into that crisis when all of those tragedies happened in Baton Rouge, because the city wasn't functioning. The courts were shut down. Now we went to the public defender board, back in 2016. And when we went to the public defender board, we were able to get bailed out because those tragedies only happened in Baton Rouge. Well, now there's a pandemic happening all across this state, all across this country. So you want to know, that means we don't get to get bailed out. We're right now in over $1 million deficit. Everybody is now going to be going to the public defender board, the state public defender board, and asking for money. So what happened to us in 2016 is now magnified and expanded across the state. That's the reason why we're asking the legislator to step in. We are asking the state to step in and save its community, because as Derwin just stated, it was us, it was the public defenders that went in, and we here in Baton Rouge, we got over 1,000 people released from jail. We dropped the population lowest to it's been since 2010. Those are people that would have died in the jail. It was overcrowded. It was overpopulated. Now, at this time, I'm hoping the legislator understands that this community deserves better, and fund its public defender's office the right way, so we could continue to save people, because we are the only watchmen of this system. And what happens when the only watchman goes underfunded? It means wrongful convictions happen, just like Norris was just speaking of. It means that criminalization of poverty happens. Mental health issues also happen. So that's what's happening right now. I'm hoping that the legislator steps in and saves this community.
So Meg, is it I guess I'm trying to understand the rift, right? Is there two sides that are really fighting over this, or do you sort of feel like actually there are allies and this is not particularly a partisan situation? How is it in the state?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't call it a partisan situation. I think we have a lot of problems in Louisiana, and the legislature is not always the most hospitable place for some of our causes, but I don't think that we have gotten to the place in Louisiana where, unfortunately, it seems that we've gotten in DC. I definitely think this is a bipartisan issue, and honestly, as Elena was talking about, we did go to the legislature this year. We put on our masks and we went in, and there was really just a handful of us, and we're like, oh no, this is a crisis and we're going to be heard. And yes, we understand that this is a time of austerity, and yes, we understand that there's a budget crisis, but we're not waiting any longer, because we know that out of terrible tragedies, that's kind of been the best opportunity for change in the history of public defense, from Katrina, and things that have happened over the years. So I did not hear a single person who was able to intelligently argue on behalf of user pay. And in fact, there is a commission in Louisiana that is headed up by a Republican. And they are looking into user pay and how user pay funds many different aspects of our criminal justice system. And they have come away with a report, which I believe is available on our state's legislative website, that talks about all of the issues with user pay and how it doesn't work, how it's not ethical, how it's not unconstitutional, but also it's just fiscally dumb. I mean, it just doesn't work, right? Because there's such a delay between the time that you collect fines and fees and then also the administrative cost, which is a really extremely euphemistic way to describe throwing poor people in jail and a debtor's prison. But anyway, that costs more money than we even recoup, right? Because it's not like people are just like, I don't want to pay my fines and fees, I'm going to play like I'm poor and go to jail to take a stand, right? No one's going to do that. People don't pay their fines and fees because they're broke. They don't have the money, so you can do whatever you want, but you're not going to get any money out of them, right? So I felt that we were quite well received. Now, sometimes it's frustrating when you're speaking to the legislature and you're explaining all of this to them, and you're realizing that it's just now dawning on them how things work. It's really frustrating because it's like, wait, y'all didn't know this, right? But I think there was genuine surprise, genuine frustration about the way that the system works. And I really do think that we were able to get the attention of folks, on both sides of the aisle. I think that they understand that user pay doesn't work. I think everybody is on board with that. As to whether they're committed, to do the follow through is another question. But we were able to secure a sizable emergency appropriation during the special session. It's not enough to carry us through the rest of the fiscal year. We are going to go back in October. We are going to go back during the regular session again. But I don't see it as a partisan issue at all. And in fact, there are lots of groups, there are a lot of conservative groups and conservative political organizations in Louisiana and across the country who have embraced public defense as one of, and adequately funding public defense is one of their primary issues and one of their primary goals. So I work with people that consider themselves Republicans, consider themselves libertarians, Democrats, what have you. And people were pretty united on this. I think it's just about pushing through the inertia, right? And making sure that they understand that we're not going away and that this is something that everybody cares about.
I'm going to give the last question, if I may, to Derwin. I think a lot of people who are at home who aren't attorneys are thinking like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What can I do to help? How would you advise people to get involved, whether they're in the state of Louisiana or even outside of the state of Louisiana? What can people do?
I think there are a number of things people can do to get involved. One is to, at the top level, reach out to your state legislators, your federal legislators and representatives, and tell them that you demand a fully funded public defender office in your jurisdiction, in your state. You demand equity and parity in your criminal legal system, top to bottom, and that includes providing public defenders with the resources they need to do the job they're called upon to do. The other thing folks can do is get involved with your local public defender. Find out what your public defender is doing, warts and all, and try to improve and transform that practice. I think in our jurisdiction, we have benefited greatly by partnering with community in a number of different ways that has helped us be more responsive and helped us be better lawyers in that regard as well. I think folks can also talk to their local, I'm talking about city, county, here we have police juries, all these local boards and decision makers. Let them know as well that everything is not okay in our criminal legal system. And we need to have equity, fairness, and justice in that system. I've been around a long time, and I'm incredibly hopeful. We recently had our city council pass a parity ordinance here in New Orleans, making the disparity between us and the district attorneys, at least with regard to their funding, little or nothing. And it's transformative, I think, for a community to see that sort of faith in fairness, that faith in justice, that faith in equity. And folks need to get up, get involved, and volunteer with your public defender, talk to your legislators and decision makers, and make it known that this is something we can conquer and that the Sixth Amendment matters.
Derwin, thank you, and a big thank you to all of my panelists, Judge Johnson, of course, and Meg Garvey, Derwin, as I mentioned, Elena Booth, and Norris Henderson. Really appreciate you guys with such incredible insight on an issue that I think a lot of people, I'm a little horrified, as Meg is, that the legislators don't know about the issue front and back, but I think a lot of just people also don't know about it. And as Derwin mentioned, and all of you well know, this is a constitutional right to a public defense, and that the history is a noble one. I think I'm quoting you correctly there, Derwin, and predates the country itself, and it is really absolutely critical and important. I should mention that there's a tool at For the Sixth, so that's for FOR, the THE, sixth SIXTH.org, all one word, .org. A nice easy tool that you can use to reach out to your legislator if you want to check that out and get some information as well. So again, big thank you to my panelists on this really incredibly important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Soledad.
Thank you.
My pleasure.